All right. So again, thank you everybody for joining the session today. Today we have Salim, who's going to be presenting some Azure Functions integration scenarios with Dynamics 365. I'm quite interested in this myself and know that we use Azure Functions a lot to offload a lot of the Dynamics 365 work, so this should be quite an interesting session to go through. And today we are recording, and all of our recordings are posted on the XRM Virtual site, which is xrmvirtual.com. So you can just hit the past events at the top. So if you're not able to attend this full session or want to look at past sessions or want to share this session with anybody else, then you can find that on the past events page. And this session should be posted up there within about 24 hours for you to view and share from there. And of course, we love Twitter, so if you aren't already following us, you can find us at XRM Virtual. So please follow us and look out for tweets of upcoming sessions, and please retweet us as well. We're always looking for speakers. You don't have to be a speaker yourself. You could be somebody that's interested in a topic and looking for a particular speaker as well. So on xrmvirtual.com, you can contact us and submit your session topics or ideas. So we're always open and interested in your feedback as part of those. Our next upcoming virtual meetings will be likely in the new year. We probably won't with the holidays be doing another session in December, but early January it will either be myself presenting the new functionality of embedding Canvas apps in model-driven forms. For those who aren't aware, model-driven forms are, of course, Dynamics 365 forms. And then we'll also have another session on backup and recovery strategies for online deployments presented by Marius. So look out for dates scheduled for those in the near future. And those should probably fall within the January, February type of time frame. And then finally, we do have some conferences coming up in the new year. So next up is UG Focus, which will be hosted in Houston, Texas. And that will be March 11th to the 14th. You can go to ugfocus.com to find out all about that. And then after that, not even a week and a half later, is the two conferences. If you're familiar with Extreme, it is more of the partner technical type event. So Extreme Europe is happening in Amsterdam, March 24th to the 27th. And then right after that, in the exact same location, is the European version of CRM UG Summit or D365 Summit or AX Summit, UG Summit. Basically, all of the user group summits in Europe are being hosted in Amsterdam the 27th to the 29th. So it'll be quite a good showing, and you can find that at usergroupsummit.com or eu.usergroupsummit.com. And that's it for me. I will pass it now back over to Salim for you to present the Azure Functions integration scenarios with Dynamics 365.
All right, thanks, Colin. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. I am about to share my screen. Up. All right, so let's get started. Well, hello everyone again, and welcome to the webinar. Hopefully, it's going to be interesting and relevant content for everybody on the line, as we'll be speaking about Azure Functions and how we integrate them with Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement, or CRM. My name is Salim Adamon. So this is me. Hello. I am a founder and solution architect at Sadax Technology, a consulting company based out of Montreal in Canada. I've been working with Microsoft Dynamics 365 since version 4.0. I've been involved in over 100 projects since then. I was a business solutions MVP, and I'm still very much involved in the communities as a blogger, as a speaker, and as a teacher. So that's me. I've recently done a lot of work around Azure Functions in some of the projects that I've been on, so I thought it was an interesting scenario to demonstrate today. So what we'll cover, first we'll talk about the Azure functions themselves. So we'll talk about definitions, we'll talk about the architecture, we'll talk about pricing structure for Azure functions, and then after that we'll go more into integration use cases with Dynamics 365 CRM, right? So what are some of the use cases that make sense for us to integrate Azure functions with D365 customer engagement? Then we'll see it in action. So we'll try and build an Azure function from the ground up, have it being integrated with CRM and do some work. And of course, I always put a session here for Q&A, but if you have any questions along the way, feel free to type them in, and we'll stop and respond to them as needed. So before we start, of course, if you don't know what Azure is, this isn't a 101 type session, right? So you kind of know Azure, you've seen the portal, you probably have heard of Azure Functions, so you're here, it's good, you'll see them in action. Same goes for Dynamics 365 CRM, right? So you have knowledge of the platform, and you also know some things about development. You don't have to be a developer, although we'll show some code, but at least have an understanding of development inside of Dynamics 365 CRM. All right. Now let's get started with the first part then, the overview of Azure Functions. So this is really where we're going to talk about definitions. First things, what are Azure Functions? Typically, the term that you'll see when people try to explain them is it's a serverless compute service. Now, what exactly does that mean? What's clear there is it's serverless, so you don't have a server, but what exactly does it mean, right? So basically, it's a service that gives you the ability to run code on demand. There is no dedicated infrastructure related to it, so you don't have to build a VM and deploy an application on it. You don't have to publish a web application. There is literally no infrastructure, and you pay for what you use. So if you only are using very little consumption, then that's what it is. If you're using more as you scale, the platform will scale with you. So this really is the idea around the serverless compute service. So some of the cool features that it gives us is it gives the ability to develop those pieces of code using multiple languages. So some of the supported languages today are JavaScript, C#, PowerShell. There's also support for Python, PHP, Bash file, and F#, I believe. There's a few more there, but I find the one that we see more often is JavaScript, C#, and PowerShell. Finally, the cool point that I like to mention here is, although you don't have a dedicated infrastructure to deploy your piece of code, the Azure functions support dependencies. So if you have a piece of code that relies on NuGet packages, for example, Newtonsoft for managing JSON queries, or enterprise library, for example, for more complex type of integration scenarios, then you have the ability to integrate your NuGet packages directly onto your Azure function, and it knows where to find them. It knows how to run your code by referencing all these dependencies. In terms of triggers, so we have pieces of code that can run and that are hosted somewhere that just run magically. What are the possible triggers? So some of them are timer based. So if you have a schedule that you predefine that you want a piece of code to run on, you'd use a timer. There's also the queue storage in Azure. So whenever a queue is inserted into an Azure storage queue, you have the ability to run an Azure function and do something with the context of the message that was posted in the queue. Very similar blob storage there. So in Azure Blob Storage, you have a file that's created or modified. You also have the ability to configure an Azure function to be called. Same idea there, because you get the context of the operation, right? So in that case, it would be the file that you would get as a reference in the context of the function that is executed. Azure Cosmos DB. You make changes in the databases, you create new rows or new data, you can trigger Azure Functions. HTTP is one of the most common one because what this means is it essentially gives you an ability to call the Azure functions manually. So you can just make a call over the web and run an Azure function and provide it a specific context that you know or you need to pass to it. Some others that are also interesting, service bus, event hub, webhooks. So there's a lot more in terms of triggers, and it's all documented fairly well on the Microsoft Azure documentation site. And I have a link to that at the end of the presentation. So if we get to share the slides, you guys will be able to get the links to refer to that information there. So that was for the triggers. The next part that I want to go into is more the architecture of the Azure functions. So I like that slide. I stole it from Microsoft, and it really explains how the Azure functions are built from an architectural standpoint, and it's really built on top of the app service and webhooks SDK. So if we look at the bottom here, app service runtime is basically whenever you have a website that you want to host into Azure, you host it in an app service. So it has hosting capabilities and a bunch of other capabilities. But what's interesting here is it allows you to host a website. So what Microsoft did is they decided to use that core platform and to say, well, instead of selling the entire app service runtime, we'll just make some very simple use cases where there's a function that is executed and you can just measure how it runs, and you can then have some code that runs without charging for the full infrastructure. So in the middle of that, there is the web jobs and the programming languages, because you have to do some abstraction of those so that all of the functions are executed in the same way by the same engine. So that's really at the architectural level what it looks like. Yeah, it's an interesting one to dive into, but that's not really what we're trying to do here. But really, it's just to give you an idea of the overall architecture, how it's built, and what are some of the components involved. I'm going to move on to pricing. There's two ways to do pricing in Azure. I'll start with the consumption plans, which is the most common that you'll see. So how it works here is it's often a combination of number of executions. So an execution would be anytime there is an event that triggers a function to run, it counts as an execution. Right, so you have a timer and it's every 5 minutes. So every five minutes a function runs, and that is an execution. The second aspect is the resource consumption per second. So that one is interesting to explain, and it's even more interesting to calculate. The idea there is Microsoft looks at whenever you're running a function, it looks at the memory that you're using on the server, and it looks at the length of time during which you're using that memory. And it comes back with a unit of measure that's called gigabyte seconds. And that is how we measure the resource consumption per second. So it's really the gigabytes of memory per second. What's important to know is you get free grants every month, 1 million executions and 400,000 gigabyte seconds of consumptions. So you get that quote unquote for free because it's basically included with the platform. And then you start paying based on execution time and based on total number of executions. So I put an example there of prices as there are in one of the US region. I believe it's US Central regions. The price, I'll go back to the price. Let me show that. The price can vary based on the regions, right? So if you're in Canada, if you're in Europe, the prices can vary, and this is really based on what Microsoft estimates that the service is worth. So we don't really have any control over that. Whenever you have an Azure function plan that you need to run, it requires a storage account, which is not included in your consumption plan here. So you have to pay for it separately using the storage payment model. So it's a little bit different. I'm not planning to dive into that today, but it's just something important to know because all of your code that has to run, it has to be hosted somewhere. I mean, it has to live somewhere, and so that's why the storage is required, because Microsoft needs to store your libraries and their dependencies and the information about the function somewhere in order for it to be run on a regular basis. The last one that I have here is the the functions are available in most Azure regions. There's only, I believe, two as of today where it's not available. So it's widely available all over the place. So there shouldn't be an issue based on where you are to find an area that's close where you can run Azure Functions from. The second pricing model is the app service plan. So the idea in this case is if you already have an app service where you're running websites or web services, then what you do is you simply reuse that to host your Azure Functions. And at that point, there is no additional cost because you already have an app service. You're already paying for that storage, for that hosting capabilities, and you basically just connect your Azure Functions to it. Okay. So now we're going to go into a little bit of the more interesting parts. So I'll talk about the structure of the function apps. When you create an app, we'll see that in Azure when I go into the demo later. But when you create an app, you have the possibility to select all of the different criteria that we just talked about. So the hosting plan, whether you want it to be a consumption plan or an app service, the location, the runtime. So there's .NET here, but you also have the ability to go with JavaScript, as I mentioned earlier. Once you do that, you go through all the parameters. Your next step is for you to go in and create functions in your function app, right? So that screenshot here shows a function app, and then in the function app, it shows all of the functions that are available there. So the structure is you have a function app and you can create multiple functions within that app, right? And the way you're going to be invoiced in the end is at the function app level. We will look at the consumption for all the functions that are underneath that function app, and this is how it gets rolled up and you get charged for your consumption. So that really is the structure here. So it's relatively simple. You got to get used to it, but once you are, it's relatively simple. Now, let's talk about the Azure Functions and Dynamics 365 customer engagement use cases. So what I have here is, with some experience in the job, I'm going to go through a list of a few items that we've seen what it makes sense to start thinking about, should we use an Azure function to replace or replicate that functionality, and does it make more sense from a architectural standpoint for a project? So the first one that I have is the recurring jobs, right? So today, when you have business logics that is executed on a recurring basis, some of the technologies that you'll find to do that are typically, it could be CRM workflows, it could be SSIS jobs, it could be a console application that runs as a scheduled task or in a Windows service, or it could even be a manual process, someone that goes into the system and runs a workflow in batch, let's say every month or every week, right? So whenever you see those type of scenarios, start thinking about, is there a possibility to move that business logic over to an Azure function? And that way we remove all of the need to having that infrastructure to maintain and all these applications to maintain locally. So that's one of the use cases. The second one that we've often seen is the reusable business logic, right? So if you have a piece of code that needs to be executed from multi-text, then maybe a good idea is to put that code in an Azure function. You have the ability to call that function from multiple sources using the HTTP trigger that I mentioned earlier. So that's one of the other scenarios that we've seen where it made a lot of sense to use Azure Functions. The next one is the long-running processes. So when you're doing batch processing or mass updates, often what we see is if you're trying to do it with CRM directly, so a CRM workflow, for example, or a plugin that goes and does some crazy operations, you have a 2-minute window to get through all of your work, or you have to call a lot of workflows on each of the records that need to be executed. So there is some impact there from a performance standpoint and architectural standpoint. Same goes if you're doing integration with external systems, right? Synchronizing data and whatnot. How you build it today probably involves something like an SSIS or a console application and whatnot. So move that over to an Azure function, and you don't have to take care of anything local anymore. It just runs in the cloud with the schedule, and you remove that limitation of the long-running processes. The next one is one that I particularly like. When you have plugin scenarios that are impacted by sandbox limitations. So if you've been doing CRM for a while, and especially on the technical side, you know that there are limitations when you are in the cloud using the plugin in sandbox mode, right? So what we do today is we do a lot of IL merge to be able to bring in libraries that we want to reference, although it's not really supported in the cloud. And we use all sort of mechanisms to be able to circumvent those constraints, right? So the idea in our case is any of the operations that are not possible to do with the plugins because of these sandbox limitations, what you do is you create an Azure function that holds that business logic, and your plugins or custom activities can simply call that Azure function via using the HTTP trigger instead. So that makes it much simpler. And it's what's important here is to really consider your costing structure, because if you're doing a lot of plugins and you're calling some of these functions all the time, then maybe there is a bigger impact on costing than if you only have a few scenarios. So but it is definitely something to consider. And lastly, reducing the cost of alternative tools, right? So whenever you're running a console application or SSIS jobs, there's always a requirement for some sort of licenses, right? So whether it's the Windows Server license, whether it's a SQL Server license, whether it's a CRM connector license to use with SSIS, there's always some impact there. So you have to think about that aspect. And also the servers that you create to run these jobs, they have to be maintained and monitored. So that has a cost in of itself. And so if you're using Azure Functions, it could be an alternative to all of that, because you're reducing your cost for some licenses, you're reducing your cost for some monitoring of servers, and in theory, it can really change how you work. So these are the use cases that we've seen on the CRM side. That are most commonly seen. There are more, of course, but these are the ones that we've seen, I'd say, over the past year or so on a very, very recurring basis. So with that, now let's go and take a look. Right? And we'll use a specific scenario here to be able to demonstrate it. The scenario would be that today, current situation is we have a user that is tasked to monthly run a workflow that recalculates the sales rankings on accounts in CRM organizations. And so what we're saying is, instead of having that manual process that happens every month by a person that may forget, may not do it at the right time, may not consider all of the records and whatnot, let's use an Azure function that is going to run at the same interval, but that is going to do the job instead of that person. So that's really the scenario that we're going to run with, and I'm going to flip over to the demo mode now, and so we'll just go and build the entire function from the ground up and see how things are connected and work with one another. Okay. Just pausing to see if there's any questions. I don't see any. Good. All right. So to start with, just to stay in my scenario here. So typically, let's say we have this individual that has to every month or every week or every day come into the CRM and run a workflow manually on all the accounts to recalculate the sales ranking, right? So you would have to go here, select all of them, and you have to click on your workflows here. And I've created a workflow that's going to recalculate sales rank, right? So I click on this and it's going to be executed on all the records that I selected, and it's going to recalculate the sales rank based on some custom business logic that we have, right? So very simple it looks, but it is a manual process. And in that case, I don't have a lot of records, but if I had thousands of records, for example, it would be a lot more time consuming to go over each page and make sure I update all the records there. So you could also potentially use DXRM Toolbox, which has a bulk workflow execution tool. So typically we'd come in here and we would select the workflow that we want to execute. we would select the query that we want to execute the records on. So in that case, I am saying I want to run this workflow. It gives me all the existing views, and I go to the accounts that I need to process, and I hit validate, and then I hit start workflow. It's going to go in, and with all the accounts that are returned by this query, it's going to run the workflow that I selected on top here. So that's the equivalent of the process that I just did manually on the CRM side, but someone has to do that manually. So we don't want that, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to use an Azure function to go around that and have this process being automated. So let's go through that exercise here. So this is the Azure Portal, and what we'll do is we'll create a new resource. So you want to look for compute, and in here you see you have a function app. So I was talking about that earlier. So let's go and create one. Virtual. I have a little bit of flexibility because I have some computing that's for free. So I use the pay as you go. I will use an existing resource group that I already have. Again, I was talking about consumption plan versus app service. I was talking about location. In that case, I will select Canada Central. Runtime, JavaScript, Java, which is in preview. I'll talk about that in one of my slides after. And storage, I mentioned that also earlier. You have to have some storage to store the content. All right, so now that we have that, we're just going to go and create this. And so it will create the function for us, and then we'll be able to use it and deploy. It will create the function app for us. Then we'll be able to deploy functions within that function app. All right, so that's going to go for, it's usually pretty fast. We're going to let that go. And we are going to go over to the coding side, which is the experience that I'm going to use to show to you guys how we can work with Azure Functions. What you should know is, in this case, I am using Visual Studio full on, but you can also write Azure Functions with Visual Studio Code or completely independently outside of Visual Studio using a basic text editor and some of the other tools that are available. Okay. So I've recently used one of these templates here. So it's the Azure Function templates that exist. You have to have the option to, you have to install the Azure development options in Visual Studio. And the reason why I use this, and you guys will see that shortly, it's extremely fast to work in that way. All the templates are there. Things go really, really smoothly when you work with this, this templating here. So let's go with XRM Virtual Function App. We are going to create this. And what you see here is it comes back with, it knows I'm trying to create a function. And I mentioned earlier that you had possibly multiple types of triggers. So it comes back to you and it says, well, okay, now what do you want to create, right? So you select the type of triggers that you want. In my case, I will use a time trigger. I will browse because this is already integrated with my credentials and connected to my Azure subscription. There we go. So I've got my functions here. Let's see if the one that I was working on was created. It hasn't been created yet. I'm going to go back onto the provisioning to see where we are at. Function apps. So this has now been successfully deployed. This is the function app that I was referring to. So you can see that in my environment, I have a few of them here. I want to work with this one here. I just want to make sure Visual Studio is able to find it. So let me try this again. Oh, Yeah, okay. That actually worked earlier. I'm simply looking for storage here. So I wanted to go into a storage space that already exists. So I'm going to point to this one. Time trigger, the schedule here. So I won't go into details here, but you can use timestamp or you can use this type of annotation to explain to the application how often you want it to run. So in that case, this means that I want it to run every 5 minutes. And we're creating the project. Shouldn't take too long. There we go. So that's pretty simple. We have some code that we now have to write in order for all of this to make some sense. And then we have to make sure this is all in a way deployed onto Azure. So how it works is, first of all, let's look for dependencies, because our objective is in this function that will name XRM virtual data updates. I'll say sales ranking update. What we want to do here is we want to have dependencies, because in that piece of code, our objective is to find the accounts that we've seen using the fetch XML query. So if I go back to my my XML toolbox, I want to use this query here. So connect to CRM, query all of these accounts, and of each of these accounts, I want to run this workflow. So that is really my objective here. So in order to do that from a development standpoint, I need to make sure I'm referencing the appropriate external libraries. So in that case, it's the Microsoft SDK libraries for XRM tooling. Oops. So this is what I want. I'm going to sign away my life and accept this. All right. So to make things a little bit faster, of course, I somewhat cheated. So I'm just going to bring in some of the stuff that I need from another page. And the idea here is that I simply want to have in the business logic that I need, I want to have the business logic that we described. So I want to come in with this function. I want to connect to Dynamics 365 using a connection string, and then it's going to give me the organization service. Just doing some logging here to show you guys the ability to log within the Azure function so that we can have a history of what happened. And then after that, we have a function that we're going to execute that is called execute recurring jobs. That function, which I am bringing in, is pretty simple in that, oops, all it does is it has the service that it received. So it's going to load a query using a fetch expression. So in that case, something that I hard-coded and pre-built somewhere. And then it's going to retrieve all the accounts by doing a retrieve multiple call using the CRM, the Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement, or CRM SDK. So it's going to return a certain number of accounts. And what we'll do is we'll run through each of these accounts, and we will run the workflow by calling the execution workflow request API and passing on the workflow ID, which I also noted somewhere, and I can just reuse here. So I'm going to bring in my CRM helper function. No, okay. I'll just create a new class because it doesn't want to copy paste. Just make sure that the class is public and static, and this is just to make the development process a little bit faster here. I will also copy the content of the class. Because it's got some sensitive information, I'll do it in a separate page. Okay. So if I go back here, what you'll see is that I no longer have errors in this piece of code. So it's able to know the connection string because it's in my helper class. Same for the fetch to be able to retrieve the accounts, and same for the workflow ID here to be able to get the unique identifier of the workflow. So what do we do with this now is we should have the ability to deploy that onto the function app that we just created as an Azure function. Okay, so let's try that, see how it works. And we're really literally doing this in minutes, so it's extremely fast. All right, so because it knows it's an Azure Function project, when I do publish, it's asking me if I want to create a new function app or if I want to use an existing one. So in my case, I want to use the one that I just created for XRM Virtual. So I should be able to see it here, and there it is. And I'm going to go OK here. So the expectation as I do this, it's going to go and publish. Yes, so some updates required. So let me check if there's any question. Okay, good questions about connectivity. So in this case, for the demo, I hard-coded a connection string with the named user, so username and password. But typically, what you want to do is to have a config file in your Azure function that has the connectivity information, and we do recommend using the application ID, not a named user. So yes, these are definitely good questions there. All right, so I'm going to check the output here, see what is happening. This is still deploying. So the expectation again, I had a function app. So what this is going to do is it's going to deploy one function under that function app. And so when this is finished, what we want to do is we want to go over to the Azure side. We want to see it, see how it's deployed, what it looks like on the Azure side, and then we can actually run it manually to see if it does what it's supposed to do. And it's taking its time a little bit. As it runs, what I'll do is I'll walk you through the expectations. Oh, and it's just finished. All right, so if I go back onto the Azure site here, if I refresh the XRM Virtual function app, what I see is that I now have a function that was created underneath it. And you saw the amount of time that it took me to get here. It was really fast, right? And so in this case here, you'll see a lot is read-only. The reason is because the Visual Studio experience took over the configuration experience for me. So it's pushing all the information in terms of configuring the Azure function to run in a certain way. If I had created the function manually directly from the web UI, then I would have had the ability to configure all of these things manually myself. So it's not the case here. Not necessarily going to run through all of these steps here, but essentially you get to see the information about your function, and you can run it from here. Now, before I run it, I already know it's supposed to run every 5 minutes. Before I do it manually, what I want to walk you guys through is the expectation in terms of process, what's going to happen when I do this. We have this view, which we took the fetch XML from, and what we're telling the application is you're going to run a workflow that will make an update in all of these rows, and that will recalculate the sales ranking. So I didn't do the actual calculation there, but what the workflow is going to do is it's going to change the date when the ranking was recalculated. So that one was last done at 11:39 by myself. And so if it runs again, or I can either wait 5 minutes or I can run it manually myself. I will see that the next updated date will be a date that is actually the same date, but the time would be around 12:40, so about right now. I'm just going to refresh to see if it already ran by itself, and it did. So when I deployed it, it actually ran by itself for the first time, and now it's waiting for 5 minutes to run again. You see that the modified user is not me, it's another account that I use, the one that is hard-coded, and the time also was changed. So it actually did what it was supposed to do, and I didn't have to come into CRM at all. I'm gonna come back to that question. Give me 1 second there. Okay, so just what I wanted to show on the Azure side was the ability to monitor what's happening. So in that case, not much. But if I were to run it, you saw that I had logs that I had written. And so these logs are actually visible down here. And you can see as it runs, these are the logs that I had in my code. So when you're done with this, you can connect to an insight environment here where all of these historical information is preserved for you to know what happened over time. And you can have, from that point on, you can have additional triggers to know when there's an error and to be able to react based on that. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. So it's not just it runs, it's you also have some logging functionalities on top of it that you can work with and have a history on what happened over time. Okay. Go back to that question that I had. If I've secured an HTTP triggered function, so only users in AD group can invoke. So that's a good question. So of course, what we're doing here is not an HTTP triggered function. It's timer based. But if we had an HTTP triggered function, what we've done in the past for this specific scenario is we added an additional layer of security on top of the HTTPS authentication with the Azure function. And we had an internal check inside of the function that was going to look at the users and see if that was a real user before it ran any of the code. So we've done that in the past, and I'm happy to give you more on that offline, Chris, if you want. If any other questions, feel free to type them in there. The other thing that I wanted to show here is the ability to create additional functions. So like I said earlier, you have a function app, and then you can have multiple functions within that app. So HTTP function, and this is just to show you guys how this works. The idea is the same. So I get presented with the list of all the triggers that exist, and I can select one, create the function. And if I do a deploy of this inside of a publish inside of my function app, it's going to work similar as what we had done in the previous deployment. It will go and update the existing function, but because I added a new one, it will also create the new function. So I'll be able to see it in here. Let me just see if it's completed. Publish completed. Okay. So if I do a refresh, there is my HTTP function. So the reason why I did this is I wanted to show that the way it comes out is a little bit different based on the type of function that it is. So in that case, you can get the function URL. So that kind of goes to your question, Chris. So we had that, and what we did is we decided to secure the function in addition to what the platform gives us. So this wasn't enough for us. We added additional parameters onto the calls of the functions, and we use those parameters to do some additional security checks when we receive that information. All right, so this is one case where you have a function URL, and so depending on the type of function that you have, the structure is going to be different, and you're going to have the ability to do different things. So that's really what I wanted to highlight here. Again, Everything is read-only because Visual Studio owns the experience and the configuration. If I were to create a function manually from here, then I would have the ability to make changes to all of these parameters manually in the JSON files, right? And same, I would also have the ability to enable, disable them directly from here. So it's a little bit different based on the source of your function, how it's created, the context in which it's created and published. So that's really important to know. All right, back to my boring slides. The last thing that I wanted to highlight, there are some new features in the Azure functions that are also interesting to take a look at and just to be aware that they exist. The first is the durable functions. So that's a relatively new. I think it was added probably only a few months ago. It was in preview before, and the idea for durable functions is to have stateful functions, meaning you run a certain execution, it finishes and it's got a certain state, certain parameters and variables that are in a certain state, and the function stops running because it needs to stop for that period of time. It stops consuming resources, and when it restarts, the system knows what the state was when it stopped. Right? So that's a new feature that just came in recently. So interesting one to take a look at. There is also geo-replication. So this has more to do with high availability scenarios where you can configure your functions to be possibly executed in multiple places, to be stored in multiple places, and there's a bunch of different features where you can make sure that there is not going to be any interruption for your functions to run. And lastly, there's Java support as well, which is in public preview. So we talked about JavaScript and we talked about C#.NET, but you can also have Java support now. That's been in public preview, I think, for about a year. So I would think it's probably a matter of time before they remove the preview tag on it. And so that is actually pretty much all I had on the topic. And if you guys have questions, now would be a good time to put them down. And if not, that's all we have. And I'm going to leave you guys with that. Check to see if there's any questions there. Nothing more.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. Thank you. Very, very insightful. Always love seeing code live as well. So lots of fun. So yeah, we can definitely leave it open for questions. If anybody has any other information they'd like to pull out of Salim, then by far, please do post it or come off mute and definitely ask.
I'll leave my contact information. If anybody wants to reach out offline, also feel free. Add me on LinkedIn or tweet or whatever.
Are you going to be speaking at any of the upcoming conferences or organizing any community events locally that people can maybe reach out to you on as well?
Absolutely. So I might be in UG and Extreme speaking. So we'll see. There's a few exciting topics around Azure and AI. And also we are organizing the Dynamics 365 Saturdays in Canada next year. So that's going to be in May, and so hopefully, Colin, you'll be part of that too.
Yep.
And that's going to happen in Toronto and Montreal.
Awesome. Yes, Montreal will be a definitely new cool location. So
yeah.
All right, so I'm going to end